May 5, 1945. Less than 72 hours remain until the total surrender of Nazi Germany. The war in Europe is practically over. But in a medieval castle lost in the Austrian Alps, something impossible is about to happen. Soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, are standing side by side with American troops, pointing their weapons not at the traditional enemy, but at other Germans. Not at just any Germans, but at the dreaded elite troops of the SS, Hitler's personal guard. Fanatics willing to kill anyone they consider a traitor. This is not a Hollywood movie. This is not an alternative fantasy. This is the Battle of Castle Itter, the only documented moment in history when Nazis and Americans fought on the same side of a trench, defending the same gate, bleeding for the same cause. And you've probably never heard of it, because this story defies everything we think we know about World War II. To understand how this surreal moment happened, we need to go back a few days in time and understand what made Castle Itter so special. It wasn't a military headquarters, it wasn't a secret weapons depot, it was a prison, but not an ordinary prison. Since 1943, the SS had transformed that 400-year-old castle into a gilded cage for high-value French prisoners. We're talking about former prime ministers, generals, tennis champions, and even the sister of Charles de Gaulle. These weren't random captives, they were leverage, human bargaining chips that Hitler believed he could trade for favorable surrender terms when the inevitable defeat came. The castle sat on a mountain slope in Tyrol, surrounded by pine forests and accessible only by a single winding road. It was isolated, defensible, and far from the chaos consuming the rest of the Reich. But by early May of 1945, that isolation became a death sentence. The SS guards who had kept these French VIPs alive for 2 years were now receiving different orders. As the Nazi regime collapsed, Heinrich Himmler's final command echoed through the SS ranks. Leave no witnesses, no loose ends, no one who could testify at war crimes trials. Across Austria and Germany, SS death squads were executing prisoners by the thousands in those final days. The guards at Castle Itter knew exactly what was expected of them. These French prisoners, who had survived years of captivity, were now just names on an extermination list. They had perhaps hours, maybe a day at most, before a squad of SS fanatics would come up that mountain road to finish the job. The prisoners knew it too. They could hear the distant artillery. They could see the smoke rising from nearby towns as the American army pushed deeper into Austria. Freedom was so close, they could almost taste it. But close doesn't matter when you're locked in a castle with no weapons, no way to communicate with the advancing Allies, and a ticking clock until the SS executioners arrive. Former French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier, the man who had signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler 7 years earlier, now found himself staring at the ultimate irony, surviving the entire war only to be murdered in its final hours. Tennis star Jean Barotra, who had won Wimbledon and represented France with pride, was reduced to pacing the castle walls, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. And Marie-Agnès Caillot, Charles de Gaulle's older sister, understood that her famous last name made her the highest value target of all. Then something unexpected happened. One of the SS guards, a man named Sebastian Wimmer, made a choice that would set this entire impossible story in motion. On May 3rd, as the regime crumbled around him, Wimmer looked at these French prisoners he'd been guarding for months and made a decision. He wasn't going to murder them, he wasn't going to follow orders. He was going to disappear into the chaos and let them fend for themselves. Before dawn on May 4th, Wimmer and most of the guards simply walked away, leaving the castle gates unlocked and the prisoners in a terrifying limbo. They were free, technically. But free to do what? Walk down the mountain into a countryside filled with desperate SS units looking for scapegoats and traitors. The Americans were coming, but they had no idea this castle existed or that French VIPs were trapped inside it. The prisoners needed help and they needed it fast. That's when Jean Barotra, the tennis champion, volunteered for the most dangerous match of his life. Barotra was 56 years old, but he was still an athlete. More importantly, he was brave to the point of recklessness. He told the other prisoners he would descend the mountain, somehow slip through the chaos of a collapsing military front, find American troops, and bring them back before the SS execution squad arrived. It was insane. The odds of success were almost zero. But doing nothing meant certain death. So on the morning of May 4th, Jean Borotra walked out of Castle Itter, down the mountain, and into one of the most bizarre rescue missions in military history. What he found in the valley below would bring together the most unlikely alliance ever forged in combat. A decorated German Wehrmacht officer who had turned against the SS, a handful of American tankers miles behind enemy lines, and a ragtag group of Austrian resistance fighters who knew the only way to survive the next 24 hours was to make a stand that defied every rule of war. Major Josef Gangl was a problem for the SS, and he knew it. A decorated Wehrmacht officer with years of combat experience on the Eastern Front, Gangl had watched his country descend into madness and decided he wanted no part of its final act. By late April of 1945, as Hitler's regime entered its death throes, Gangl had made a decision that would have gotten him executed on the spot just weeks earlier. He joined the Austrian resistance. Not quietly, not symbolically, but actively. He was hiding in the town of Wörgl, just a few miles from Castle Itter, coordinating with local resistance fighters and trying to prevent the SS from destroying the town in a last spiteful act of scorched earth. Gangl understood something that many fanatical SS officers refused to accept. The war was over, and continuing to fight only meant more Austrian and German civilians would die for nothing. But switching sides in the final days of the war was incredibly dangerous. The SS were hunting deserters and resistance collaborators with psychotic efficiency, executing them in town squares as examples. Gangl was playing a deadly game, and he knew the SS had his name on a list. On May 4th, as Gangl met with resistance leaders in a Wörgl cafe, something unusual happened. A man burst through the door, breathless and frantic, speaking rapid French. It was Jean Borotra, the tennis champion from Castle Itter. He had somehow made it down the mountain, through SS checkpoints and chaos, and found his way to the resistance. Through broken German and frantic hand gestures, Borotra explained the situation. 14 high-value French prisoners trapped in a castle, abandoned by their guards, waiting for either American rescue or SS execution, whichever arrived first. Gangl listened carefully and realized this was bigger than he initially thought. If the SS discovered these French VIPs were unguarded, they would send a death squad immediately. But if Gangl could somehow hold that castle until the Americans arrived, he could save 14 lives and perhaps redeem some small part of what his country had become. There was just one enormous problem. Gangl had maybe 10 Austrian resistance fighters with hunting rifles and old pistols. That wasn't nearly enough to defend a castle against an SS assault. Borotra had an answer. He'd seen American tanks in the valley, pushing through the scattered German defenses. If they could find those Americans and convince them to come to the castle, they might have a chance. Gangl made a decision that would seal his fate. He would personally escort Borotra to find the American forces, explain the situation, and hope to God they believed this insane story. A German Wehrmacht officer and a French tennis star walking together through a war zone, looking for American soldiers to recruit for a joint rescue mission. If someone had pitched this as a movie script, it would have been rejected as too unrealistic. But this was May 1945 in Austria, where reality had become stranger than any fiction. They found the Americans just outside the town of Kufstein. Specifically, they found Captain John Lee and a small relief force from the 12th Armored Division, including one Sherman tank. Lee was a by-the-book officer from Connecticut, the kind of man who followed orders and didn't appreciate surprises. When a German officer and a Frenchman approached his position, claiming that French VIPs were trapped in a castle and needed immediate rescue, Lee's first instinct was to assume it was a trap. This was exactly the kind of scheme desperate SS units were using to ambush American patrols. But something about Gangl convinced him. Maybe it was the way Gangl carried himself, the quiet dignity of a professional soldier who had seen too much. Maybe it was the desperation in Borotra's eyes, or maybe Lee just understood that in the dying days of the war the old rules no longer applied. Captain Lee made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would take his small force, including the Sherman tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, and head up that mountain to Castle Itter. He would trust a German officer he'd just met. He would walk into a potential ambush to save French prisoners he'd never heard of. And he would do it because, despite everything, it was the right thing to do. On the afternoon of May 4th, the most unlikely convoy in World War II history began moving toward Castle Itter. 1 Sherman tank, 2 American trucks carrying 14 GIS, a German Wehrmacht major, a handful of Austrian resistance fighters, and 1 exhausted French tennis champion. They had no idea that by the next morning they would be fighting for their lives against an enemy that should have already surrendered. The convoy reached Castle Itter just before nightfall on May 4th. As the Sherman tank rumbled through the medieval gates, the French prisoners couldn't believe what they were seeing. American soldiers, yes, but also German Wehrmacht troops in full uniform, working together, setting up defensive positions side by side. Former Prime Minister Édouard Daladier stood in the courtyard, watching this impossible scene unfold, probably wondering if the stress of captivity had finally driven him insane. But this was real. Captain Lee immediately began assessing the castle's defenses, and what he found was not encouraging. The castle had thick stone walls, yes, but it was designed to repel attacks from medieval armies, not 20th century weapons. The single access road made it easy to defend, but also meant there was no escape route if things went wrong. They had 1 tank, limited ammunition, and maybe 20 fighters total when you counted the Americans, Gangel's resistance fighters, and a few German soldiers who had followed their officer into this madness. Against a determined SS assault, those numbers were not good. Major Gangel worked alongside Captain Lee, translating, coordinating, and helping position the defenses. This was surreal for everyone involved. American soldiers who had spent years fighting Germans were now taking tactical advice from a Wehrmacht officer. The French prisoners, still processing their sudden liberation, watched enemy soldiers preparing to die defending them. One of the German soldiers, a young man barely 20 years old, kept glancing nervously at the Americans, clearly terrified they would shoot him the moment the situation stabilized. But Lee had made his priorities clear. Right now, the enemy was the SS, and anyone willing to fight against them was an ally. The rules of war had been suspended for 1 night in this isolated castle. They spent the evening fortifying positions, moving furniture to block windows, and rationing what little ammunition they had. The Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, was positioned to cover the main gate, its 75mm gun aimed down the access road. If the SS came, they would have to come up that road and the tank would make them pay for every meter. As night fell, Captain Lee tried to radio for reinforcements, but the mountains interfered with the signal. They were on their own. The French prisoners, desperate to help, volunteered to carry ammunition, watch for movement, anything to contribute. These were not soldiers, but they understood what was at stake. Tennis champion Jean Borotre, who had already proven his courage by descending the mountain alone, stationed himself at a window with a rifle he barely knew how to use. Former generals and politicians, men who once commanded armies and shaped nations, now crouched behind stone walls waiting for an attack they weren't sure they could survive. Major Gangel pulled Captain Lee aside and spoke bluntly. The SS would come at dawn, he said. That's when they always attacked. They would hit hard and fast, trying to overwhelm the defenses before the Americans could bring in reinforcements. Gangel estimated they might face 50 to 100 SS troops, possibly more. Fanatics who believed dying for the Führer in the last days of the war was the highest honor. Lee did the math in his head. 1 tank, limited shells, 20 rifles, maybe a few hundred rounds per man. No reinforcements coming, no air support, no escape route. If the SS brought heavy weapons or simply decided to sacrifice enough men, the castle would fall. But giving up wasn't an option. These 14 French prisoners had survived years of Nazi captivity. They weren't going to die now. Not on his watch, not when freedom was 72 hours away. Lee made his decision. They would hold the castle at all costs. If the SS wanted these prisoners, they would have to go through an American tank, a German major, and every man willing to stand on those walls. It was insane, tactically questionable, and probably suicidal. but it was also the right thing to do. The night passed slowly. Men took turns sleeping and standing watch. The castle was eerily quiet except for the distant rumble of artillery from the collapsing German front. Everyone knew what was coming. The SS had undoubtedly heard about the situation by now. A German officer had betrayed the Reich. Americans were defending a castle deep in Austrian territory, and 14 high-value prisoners, witnesses to war crimes, were still alive. For the fanatics of the SS, this was unacceptable. As the first light of dawn broke over the Austrian Alps on May 5th, the defenders of Castle Itter could see movement on the road below. Dark shapes moving through the trees, vehicles approaching. The SS had arrived, and the most bizarre battle of World War II was about to begin. The attack began just after 4 in the morning, with the crack of rifle fire echoing through the mountain valley. The SS troops, estimated at over 150 men, had surrounded the castle during the night, using the forest as cover. These were not regular Wehrmacht soldiers looking for an excuse to surrender. These were Waffen-SS veterans, members of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, men who had fought on the Eastern Front and who viewed surrender as treason. They had orders to eliminate everyone in the castle, the French prisoners, the American soldiers, and especially Major Gangl, the traitor who dared to switch sides. The first wave came up the access road, using the early morning fog as concealment. The Sherman tank Besotten Jenny opened fire immediately. The 75mm gun roared, and the lead SS vehicle exploded in a ball of flame. The concussion shook the entire castle. For a moment, the SS advance stalled, but these were experienced soldiers and they quickly adapted, spreading out into the forest and beginning a systematic encirclement. Captain Lee realized immediately that this was going to be a siege, not a quick assault. The SS weren't going to charge suicidally into the tank's gun. They were going to probe for weaknesses, use sniper fire to pin down defenders, and wait for the tank to run out of ammunition. And ammunition was already a critical problem. The Sherman had maybe 20 shells remaining. Each rifle had perhaps 100 rounds. Once those were gone, the castle's thick walls would be the only thing standing between the defenders and a massacre. Major Gangl moved from position to position, directing fire, keeping the inexperienced Austrian resistance fighters calm, and coordinating with Lee. The partnership between the German and American officers was seamless now. There was no time for nationality or ideology. There was only the immediate tactical problem: hold the walls, conserve ammunition, and pray that reinforcements arrived before the SS overran them. The French prisoners, meanwhile, had become active participants in their own defense. Edouard Daladier was helping reload weapons. Tennis star Jean Borotra had taken up a sniper position in one of the towers. These men, who had spent years as helpless captives, were now fighting back. The SS changed tactics around mid-morning. They brought up an 88mm anti-tank gun, the same weapon that had destroyed countless Allied tanks throughout the war. If they got that gun into position with a clear line of sight to the Sherman, the battle would be over in seconds. Lee saw the danger immediately and ordered the tank to shift position, using the castle's stone walls as cover. But moving the tank meant abandoning the gate, which was exactly what the SS wanted. The moment Besotten Jenny moved, a squad of SS troops rushed the main entrance. American and German rifles opened fire simultaneously, cutting down the attackers in a brutal crossfire. Bodies fell on the cobblestones just meters from the gate. The SS pulled back, leaving their dead behind. It was a stark reminder of what was at stake. This was not going to end with surrender or negotiation. This was going to end with one side completely destroyed. By noon, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Sherman tank had fired its last shell. Without the tank's cannon, the SS could move more freely, tightening the noose around the castle. Rifle ammunition was running critically low. Some defenders were down to their last magazine. The SS, sensing weakness, intensified their sniper fire, making it nearly impossible for anyone to move in the courtyard without drawing fire. One American soldier was hit in the shoulder. An Austrian resistance fighter took a round through the leg. The castle's thick medieval walls were still holding, but they couldn't hold forever. Captain Lee knew they had maybe 2 hours before the SS launched a final overwhelming assault that the defenders simply couldn't repel. He tried the radio again, screaming for reinforcements, but got only static. They were still alone, still cut off, and now almost out of ammunition. Then Major Joseph Gangl made a decision that would cost him everything. He saw an SS sniper team setting up in a building across from the castle, positioning themselves to fire directly into the courtyard where the French prisoners were sheltering. If that sniper got into position, the prisoners would be completely exposed. Without hesitation, Gangl ran into the open courtyard, waving and shouting to draw the sniper's attention away from the civilians. It worked. The SS sniper shifted his aim toward the German officer. Gangl dove for cover, but he was a half-second too slow. The bullet caught him in the head, and he dropped instantly. The man who had abandoned the SS, who had joined the resistance, who had brought the Americans to this castle, who had fought alongside his former enemies to protect 14 French lives, died on the cobblestones of Castle Itter, with just hours remaining in the European war. Captain Lee watched it happen from across the courtyard, powerless to help, and in that moment understood the terrible price of doing the right thing. Major Gangl's death hit the defenders like a physical blow. The German soldiers who had followed him into this impossible fight saw their leader fall and understood they were now completely committed. There was no walking away from this. The SS would execute them as traitors the moment the castle fell. The Americans felt it too. Gangl had earned their respect in less than 24 hours, proving that honor could transcend nationality and uniform. But there was no time to mourn. The SS sensed blood in the water and pressed their advantage. Sniper fire intensified. Mortar rounds began falling inside the castle walls, sending shrapnel ricocheting off ancient stone. One round landed in the courtyard, wounding 2 more defenders and sending the French prisoners scrambling for cover in the castle's interior rooms. Captain Lee assessed the situation with brutal clarity. They had maybe 30 minutes of ammunition left, no heavy weapons, and an enemy that was preparing for a final assault. The only question now was whether they would die fighting or surrender and be executed anyway. Then in the distance, Lee heard something beautiful. The rumble of American tanks, multiple tanks. An entire relief column from the 12th Armored Division was pushing up the mountain road, having finally received Lee's earlier distress calls. The cavalry was coming, but they were still 10 minutes away, maybe 15, and the SS could hear them too. The enemy commander had to make a choice: launch an immediate all-out assault and try to massacre everyone before reinforcements arrived, or withdraw and escape into the mountains. For a moment, the entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath. The SS troops stopped firing. The defenders on the castle walls stopped shooting back. Everyone was listening to those approaching tank engines, calculating distances and time. Then the SS made their decision. They would attack now immediately with everything they had. It was all or nothing. The final assault was absolutely savage. SS troops came from 3 directions simultaneously, using smoke grenades to obscure their approach. They reached the castle walls and began trying to scale them, using ladders and grappling hooks. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out on the ramparts, as defenders used rifle butts, fists, and anything else they could grab to push back the attackers. The Sherman tank, out of main gun ammunition, used its machine guns to rake the SS positions, the gunner firing in controlled bursts to conserve the last belts of ammunition. Jean Borotra, the 56-year-old tennis champion, was fighting with a rifle like a soldier half his age. Former generals and prime ministers were passing ammunition and helping wounded defenders. This was no longer about nationality or politics. This was pure survival. The SS troops got a ladder against the north wall, and 3 soldiers started climbing. An American GI leaned over and shot the first climber at point-blank range. The body fell backwards, taking the other 2 down with it. The ladder crashed to the ground. Just when it seemed the defenders would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, the lead American tanks from the relief column came into view on the access road. The commander of that column, Lieutenant John Cram, assessed the situation instantly and didn't hesitate. His tanks opened fire on the SS positions with everything they had. High explosive shells tore through the forest where the SS had set up their command post. Machine gun fire raked the enemy troops trying to scale the castle walls. The effect was immediate and devastating. The SS assault collapsed. Troops that had been seconds away from breaching the castle suddenly found themselves caught between the defenders above and American armor below. They broke and ran, disappearing into the forest in small groups, abandoning their dead and wounded. The Battle of Castle Itter was over. The most unlikely alliance in World War II history had held just long enough. 14 French prisoners who should have died in the war's final hours were safe. American soldiers who had trusted an enemy officer had survived. And that enemy officer, Major Joseph Gangel, had given his life to prove that even in the darkest moments of history, individual courage and conscience still mattered. Captain Lee walked through the castle courtyard after the shooting stopped, past the wounded being treated by medics, past the exhausted defenders slumped against walls, and stopped at the spot where Major Gangel had fallen. The German officer's body had been moved, but the bloodstain remained on the ancient stones. Lee stood there for a long moment, thinking about a man he'd known for less than 24 hours, but would remember for the rest of his life. A man who had been his enemy on paper, but his brother in the only way that truly mattered. The French prisoners emerged from the castle's interior, blinking in the afternoon sunlight, unable to fully process that they had survived. They had been hours away from execution, then caught in a firefight, then saved by the most impossible coalition ever assembled. Edouard Daladier, who had negotiated with Hitler before the war, now shook hands with American soldiers and German Wehrmacht troops who had fought together to save his life. The war wasn't officially over yet, but in this small corner of Austria, something had ended and something else, something harder to define, had begun. The French prisoners were evacuated from Castle Itter within hours of the battle's end. American trucks carried them down the mountain to safety, away from the smoke and blood and chaos that had defined their final hours of captivity. They would return to France as heroes, survivors of a war that had taken everything from their country and nearly taken their lives in its final moments. But before they left, several of them made a point of finding the German soldiers who had defended them. These men, who had every reason to hate anyone in a Wehrmacht uniform, shook hands with their former enemies and thanked them for their courage. Jean Borotra, the tennis champion who had risked everything to bring help, specifically sought out the young German soldier who had spent the entire battle terrified the Americans would shoot him. Borotra embraced him and said something in broken German that made the young man cry. It was a moment of humanity in the midst of inhumanity, a brief acknowledgement that the men who had fought together on those walls were connected by something deeper than national flags or political ideology. Captain Lee faced a different kind of problem. He had American soldiers under his command who had fought alongside German troops. He had personally trusted and coordinated with a Wehrmacht officer. In any other circumstance, this would have been court-martial material, possible treason. But these were not normal circumstances, and Lee's superiors understood that. The US Army quietly decided that the Battle of Castle Itter would be recognized but not heavily publicized. It was too complicated, too messy, too difficult to fit into the clean narrative of good versus evil that the war required. Lee received a commendation for his actions, but the details of who he'd fought alongside were conveniently omitted from official reports. The German soldiers who had defended the castle were processed as prisoners of war, but their role in the battle earned them unusually lenient treatment. They were not charged as war criminals. They were not sent to harsh detention camps. They had switched sides at the last possible moment and fought against the SS, and that counted for something, even if no one wanted to talk about it publicly. Major Joseph Gangel became a different kind of problem for history. He was a German officer who had turned against his own country's regime, fought alongside the enemy and died defending French prisoners from SS execution. Was he a hero? A traitor? Both? Neither? The Austrian town of Würgel, where Gangel had lived and worked with the resistance, eventually erected a memorial to him. A street was named in his honor. But for decades, many Germans refused to acknowledge him at all. To some, he remained a deserter who had betrayed his oath and his uniform. To others, he was one of the few Wehrmacht officers who had the moral courage to recognize when loyalty to the regime meant complicity in evil. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative allowed. Gangel had spent years fighting for Germany. He had believed in his duty as a soldier. But somewhere in the final collapse of the Nazi state, he had drawn a line and decided that some orders could not be followed, that some fights were not worth fighting, and that protecting innocent lives mattered more than loyalty to a dying regime. The Battle of Castle Itter officially ended at 4:15 in the afternoon on May 5, 1945. Less than 72 hours later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The SS troops who had attacked the castle either melted into the civilian population or were captured by advancing Allied forces. None of them were ever specifically identified or prosecuted for the assault. The 88mm anti-tank gun they had brought to destroy the Sherman tank was found abandoned in the forest. The bodies of the SS soldiers killed in the fighting were buried in unmarked graves. It was as if the battle had been an aberration, a strange footnote that didn't fit comfortably into anyone's version of how the war was supposed to end. And perhaps that's exactly what it was. A moment when the rules broke down completely, when enemies became allies out of necessity and moral clarity, and when a group of men decided that protecting 14 lives was worth dying for, regardless of what uniform anyone was wearing. The French prisoners returned home to a country still recovering from 4 years of occupation. Édouard Daladier resumed his political career, though his legacy remained complicated by his pre-war appeasement of Hitler. Jean Borotrain returned to tennis and became a legend not just for his athletic achievements, but for his extraordinary courage during the war's final days. Marie-Agnès Caillot, de Gaulle's sister, reunited with her famous brother and lived quietly, rarely speaking about her captivity or the impossible battle that had saved her life. The other prisoners scattered across France, resuming lives that had been interrupted by war and captivity. Some wrote memoirs, some gave interviews, but most preferred to move on, to forget, to rebuild. The Battle of Castle Itter was a story they told at dinner parties occasionally, usually met with disbelief. A story about the day German and American soldiers fought together. A story that sounded too impossible to be true. For decades, the Battle of Castle Itter remained buried in military archives and obscure history books. The US Army didn't actively suppress the story, but they didn't promote it either. It was too strange, too complicated, and it raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of the enemy. Americans had been told for 4 years that all Germans were evil, that the Wehrmacht and the SS were equally complicit in Nazi atrocities, and that there could be no common ground with anyone who wore a swastika. The Battle of Castle Itter challenged that narrative in ways that post-war America wasn't ready to process. How do you explain to a nation that lost over 400,000 sons that some of those German soldiers were capable of courage and sacrifice? How do you reconcile the image of the monolithic Nazi war machine with the reality of individual men making individual choices in impossible circumstances? It was easier to simply not talk about it, to let it fade into the background noise of a war that had produced thousands of battles and millions of stories. Captain John Lee returned to Connecticut after the war and lived a quiet life. He rarely spoke about Castle Itter, even to his own family. When he did mention it, people assumed he was exaggerating or misremembering. The idea that he had fought alongside German soldiers seemed so absurd that most listeners dismissed it as a confusion of details or an embellishment that had grown over time. Lee didn't push back. He had his commendation, he had his memories, and he had the knowledge that he'd done the right thing when it mattered most. That was enough. He died in 1973, largely unknown outside his community, never having received the broader recognition that his actions at Castle Itter deserved. His obituary mentioned his military service, but made no reference to the battle that had defined his war. It was as if that day in May of 1945 had never happened, as if history had quietly erased one of its most extraordinary moments simply because it didn't fit the approved narrative. The German soldiers who had fought at Castle Itter faced an even more complicated legacy. In post-war Germany, admitting you had served in the Wehrmacht was difficult enough. Admitting you had deserted and fought alongside Americans against your own countrymen was nearly impossible. These men returned to a country that was physically and morally destroyed, divided between occupying powers, and desperately trying to process the full scale of the Holocaust and Nazi atrocities. There was no appetite for nuanced stories about good Germans who had switched sides at the last minute. The narrative was simpler. Germany had been collectively guilty, collectively defeated, and now needed to collectively rebuild and atone. Individual acts of conscience, especially ones that came in the war's final days, were viewed with suspicion. Were these men truly heroes, or were they simply cowards who had jumped ship when defeat became inevitable? The former prisoners they had saved vouched for them, but even that testimony couldn't fully protect them from judgment in a society that was struggling to define guilt and innocence in absolute terms. The castle itself stood empty for years after the war. The Austrian government didn't know what to do with it. It had been a prison, then a battlefield, then an embarrassing reminder of the war's chaotic final days. Tourism officials considered turning it into a museum, but worried that glorifying a battle where Germans and Americans fought together might send the wrong political message during the Cold War. So Castle Itter simply sat there, slowly deteriorating, its walls still scarred by bullet impacts and shell fragments. Local kids would sneak in occasionally, exploring the abandoned rooms and finding spent shell casings in the courtyard. Old-timers in the nearby towns would tell the story of the battle to anyone who would listen, but their accounts varied wildly. Some said hundreds of soldiers had fought there, others claimed it was just a small skirmish. The truth was somewhere in between, but without official recognition or documentation, the story became legend, and legends are always unreliable. It wasn't until the early 2000s that historians finally began seriously researching the Battle of Castle Itter and piecing together what had actually happened. Author Stephen Harding spent years tracking down documents, interviewing survivors and their families, and reconstructing the timeline of that impossible day. His book, published in 2013, finally brought the story to a wider audience and confirmed what the participants had known all along. This had really happened exactly as impossibly as it sounded. German and American soldiers had fought together. A Wehrmacht major had died defending French prisoners from the SS. A tennis champion had saved 14 lives with a desperate run down a mountain. And for one brief moment in history, the enemy had become an ally because doing the right thing mattered more than following orders or maintaining ideological purity. The book sparked renewed interest in the battle, and suddenly Castle Itter was being discussed in history classes, featured in documentaries, and recognized as one of the most unique military engagements of the entire war. The rediscovery of the Battle of Castle Itter raised profound questions about how we remember war and who we choose to call heroes. Major Joseph Gangl, dead for almost 70 years by the time his story reached mainstream attention, became a symbol of something Americans desperately wanted to believe: that individual conscience could triumph over institutional evil, that it was never too late to do the right thing, and that courage could be found in the most unexpected places. The Austrian town of Würgl, which had quietly honored Gangl for decades, suddenly found itself hosting historians, documentary crews, and battlefield tourists who wanted to walk the same streets where Gangl had coordinated with the resistance. The street named after him, once just a small act of local remembrance, became a pilgrimage site for people trying to understand how an enemy soldier became a hero. But this attention also brought uncomfortable scrutiny. Gangl had spent years fighting for the Wehrmacht. He had served on the Eastern Front, where unspeakable atrocities were committed. His decision to switch sides came in the war's final week, when Germany's defeat was absolutely certain. Was he truly motivated by moral conviction, or was he simply trying to survive and secure better treatment as a prisoner of war? These questions have no easy answers, and that's exactly what makes the story so important. History is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It's a complex web of choices made by imperfect people in impossible circumstances. Gangl made terrible choices by continuing to serve the Nazi regime for as long as he did. He also made an extraordinary choice by risking everything to protect 14 innocent lives when he could have simply walked away or followed orders. Both things can be true simultaneously. The same complexity applies to the other German soldiers who fought at Castle Itter. They had been part of a military machine that enabled genocide and conquered most of Europe. They had worn the uniform and taken the oath. But in that specific moment, they chose differently. They chose to defend prisoners rather than execute them. They chose to fight alongside their enemies rather than die for a cause that had already lost. And several of them were wounded or killed, making that choice. Does their final act redeem their earlier complicity? No. Does it matter anyway? Absolutely. Captain Lee's decision to trust Gangle and lead his men into that castle was equally complicated. He violated standard military protocol by accepting help from enemy forces. He put his soldiers at enormous risk based on the word of a German officer he'd just met. If the battle had gone differently, if it had been a trap, Lee would have been remembered as a fool who got his men killed. But it wasn't a trap, and his willingness to see past the uniform and recognize shared humanity saved 14 lives and created one of the most remarkable moments in military history. Lee's story reminds us that following orders and sticking to protocol isn't always the same as doing the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking enormous risks, trusting your instincts, and accepting that you might be wrong. Lee bet his career and his life on the belief that Joseph Gangle was telling the truth, and he was right. But it could have easily gone the other way. The French prisoners who survived Castle Itter carried their own complicated legacies. Édouard Daladier had signed the Munich Agreement, effectively handing Czechoslovakia to Hitler in a failed attempt at appeasement. His pre-war decisions had contributed to the very conflict that nearly killed him. Yet he also survived years of Nazi captivity with dignity and was ultimately saved by an alliance that never should have existed. Jean Borotra, celebrated as a hero for his courage, had also briefly served in the Vichy government before turning against the Nazi occupation. These were not simple heroes from a storybook. They were flawed men who had made mistakes, served questionable causes, and then found themselves in a situation where none of that mattered because survival required everyone to work together. Their story is a reminder that redemption is possible, that past failures don't have to define future actions, and that courage can emerge in the most unexpected moments. Perhaps the most important lesson from Castle Itter is that war creates strange moral landscapes where the usual rules don't apply. In the clean narrative we prefer, enemies are always enemies, and allies are always allies. The Germans were the bad guys, the Americans and French were the good guys, and never the two shall meet except on opposite sides of a battlefield. But Castle Itter explodes that simplicity. It shows us a moment where nationality and ideology mattered less than a shared commitment to protecting innocent lives. It shows us SS fanatics who were willing to massacre prisoners in the war's final hours, and it shows us Wehrmacht soldiers who were willing to die preventing that massacre. It shows us that even within the Nazi military machine, there were men capable of recognizing evil and choosing differently. That doesn't absolve the Wehrmacht of its crimes or minimize German responsibility for the Holocaust, but it does remind us that individuals always have choices, and sometimes those choices define us more than the uniforms we wear or the flags we serve. Today, Castle Itter has been restored and converted into a luxury hotel, a transformation that feels almost obscenely peaceful, given what happened there in May of 1945. Guests can rent the same rooms where French prisoners once waited for either rescue or execution. They can have dinner in the courtyard where Major Gangle fell. They can sleep in medieval beds and wake up to mountain views without ever knowing that the stone walls around them are pockmarked with bullet holes that have been carefully plastered over. The hotel's website mentions the battle in passing, a quirky historical footnote to attract history buffs, but there's no memorial on site, no plaque marking where the fighting was most intense. Nothing to indicate that this picturesque castle was once the site of one of the strangest battles in human history. It's been sanitized, commodified, turned into a destination for wealthy tourists who want authentic Austrian charm without the messy complications of actual history. This erasure is not accidental. Castle Itter represents a story that nobody quite knows how to tell. For Americans, it complicates the narrative of World War II as a purely righteous crusade against absolute evil. For Germans, it raises uncomfortable questions about Wehrmacht complicity and the timing of moral awakenings. For the French, it's a reminder that their liberation depended partly on the actions of German soldiers, which doesn't fit neatly into the resistance mythology that France built after the war. And for Austria, which spent decades pretending it was Hitler's first victim rather than an enthusiastic participant in the Nazi project, Castle Itter is a reminder of the chaos and moral ambiguity that defined the war's final days. So the battle has been acknowledged but not celebrated, recognized but not commemorated, remembered but not memorialized. It exists in a strange liminal space, too documented to be forgotten, but too complicated to be properly honored. The few memorials that do exist are small and local. Wörgl maintains its street named after Gangl. A modest plaque marks the site where he coordinated with the resistance before heading to the castle. Some of the French survivors erected a private memorial in France, but it's not widely known or visited. There's no Hollywood movie about Castle Itter, no major monument, no annual ceremony. Compare this to other battles from the same period. D-Day has massive memorials, annual commemorations, and countless films. The Battle of the Bulge is taught in every American high school. Even smaller engagements have been immortalized in popular culture. But Castle Itter remains obscure, known primarily to military history enthusiasts and readers of specialized books. It's as if collective memory has decided that some stories are too strange to integrate into the simplified narratives we use to understand the past. Yet the story persists, passed along through books, documentaries, and increasingly through YouTube videos and podcasts that cater to audiences hungry for untold histories. Modern viewers seem more ready to embrace the complexity of Castle Itter than previous generations were. Perhaps it's because we've moved far enough from World War II that we can see it as history rather than lived experience. Perhaps it's because our current era is so polarized that stories of enemies working together have a special resonance. Or perhaps it's simply that the story is so inherently dramatic, so cinematic in its improbability, that it demands to be told regardless of how inconvenient it is for simplified narratives. Whatever the reason, Castle Itter is finally getting the attention it deserves, even if that attention comes 70 years too late for most of the men who fought there. The battle has also become a touchstone in debates about the nature of evil and responsibility. Can individuals within evil systems be redeemed through single acts of courage? Does Gangl's sacrifice erase his years of service to the Wehrmacht? Does the German soldiers' defense of French prisoners absolve them of whatever they did before that day? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They're deeply practical issues about how we judge people who lived through moral catastrophes. The easy answer is to say that Gangl and the others were still guilty, that their final act doesn't change their complicity in Nazi crimes, and that we should view them with appropriate skepticism. The harder answer is to acknowledge that people can change, that conscience can awaken even after years of sleep, and that acts of extraordinary courage matter even when they come from imperfect or compromised individuals. Castle Itter doesn't resolve this debate. If anything, it makes it more complicated. But maybe that's exactly what we need, stories that refuse to be simple, that challenge our assumptions, and that force us to think harder about judgment and redemption. The Battle of Castle Itter matters today for reasons that go beyond military history or World War II trivia. It matters because it shows us that even in humanity's darkest moments, when industrial-scale evil had consumed an entire continent, individuals still had agency and could still choose differently. Major Joseph Gangl didn't have to join the Austrian resistance. He could have disappeared into the chaos of the collapsing Reich and survived without ever taking a moral stand. Captain John Lee didn't have to trust a German officer or risk his men on a rescue mission for prisoners he'd never met. He could have followed protocol, waited for orders, and let someone else make the difficult call. Jean Borotra didn't have to run down that mountain alone, unarmed, through SS-controlled territory to find help. He could have stayed in the castle and hoped for the best. But these men chose action over passivity, courage over caution, and human connection over tribal loyalty. Their choices created a moment that shouldn't have been possible, a battle that shouldn't have happened, an alliance that defied every rule of war. The story also matters because it's been deliberately obscured, and we should ask ourselves why. Why has one of the most extraordinary moments in World War II been relegated to footnote status, while less remarkable battles are taught in every school and depicted in countless films? Part of the answer is practical. Castle Itter doesn't fit into the narrative structure we use to teach history. It happened in the war's final days, after the main outcomes were decided, in a location that had no strategic importance. But the deeper answer is ideological. Castle Itter complicates the story we tell ourselves about World War II as a clear-cut battle between absolute good and absolute evil. It introduces shades of grey into a conflict we prefer to remember in black and white. It suggests that enemy soldiers could be heroes and that moral choices remained relevant even when the war was essentially over. These complications are uncomfortable, so we've collectively chosen to minimize them, to treat Castle Itter as a curiosity rather than a central example of what war really looks like when you zoom in close enough to see individual human beings making individual choices. But perhaps the most important reason this story matters is what it suggests about our current moment. We live in an increasingly polarized world where we're encouraged to view entire groups of people as irredeemably other, as enemies who can never be allies, as threats that must be defeated rather than humans who might be reasoned with. Castle Itter is a rebuke to that mindset. It shows us that even in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, with genuine evil that needed to be fought and defeated, there was still room for individuals to transcend group identity and work together toward a common goal. If a German Wehrmacht officer and an American tank commander could put aside their differences in May of 1945, what does that say about our own supposedly insurmountable divisions? If French prisoners could trust the German soldiers defending them, what does that say about our inability to trust people from the other side of our own conflicts? The men who fought at Castle Itter are almost all gone now. Captain Lee died in the 1970s. The French prisoners have passed away. The German soldiers who fought alongside them are dead. Even the younger witnesses, the children who lived in nearby towns and watched the battle from a distance, are in their 80s and 90s now. Soon there will be no one left who remembers that day firsthand, no living connection to the impossible alliance that held a castle for just long enough to save 14 lives. The story will exist only in books and documentaries and videos like this one, and that makes it more important than ever to tell it, to preserve it, to refuse to let it fade into complete obscurity. Because Castle Itter is not just a weird footnote from World War II. It's evidence that humans are capable of more than we think, that loyalty to abstract ideologies can be transcended by loyalty to concrete human beings, and that it's never too late to choose differently. So remember this story. Remember that on May 5th, 1945, in a medieval castle in the Austrian Alps, something impossible happened. Remember Joseph Gangel, who gave his life defending people he'd been taught to hate. Remember John Lee, who risked everything on trust and intuition. Remember Jean Barotra, who ran through a war zone to save his fellow prisoners. Remember the 14 French VIPs who survived against impossible odds. And remember the lesson that their story teaches us, that even in the darkest moments, when every incentive pushes toward tribalism and violence and othering, individual human beings can still choose connection over division, courage over compliance, and humanity over ideology. The Battle of Castle Itter was erased from popular memory because it was inconvenient, because it complicated simple narratives, because it forced uncomfortable questions about enemies and allies and redemption. But inconvenient truths are often the most important ones. And this truth, this impossible day when Nazis and Americans fought side by side against the SS, is a truth that deserves to be remembered, celebrated, and held up as an example of what's possible when we choose to see the human being standing across from us rather than just the uniform they're wearing. That's the real legacy of Castle Itter. Not just that it happened, but that it proves something we desperately need to believe, that we're capable of better, even when everything suggests otherwise.